So I kind of put the outline slide back inside here. So these were, again, this was the list of everything that we put together based off the feedback that I received from you guys. So we covered kind of like the team dynamics, so the front end spectrum, the umbrella for UX, and how teams should work together. With that, we kind of touched also the beginning stages of the project process. We talked about the current digital landscape for web development, so the web as a whole, and like the evolution of where we are today. We talked about an introduction to responsive web design, contextual design, and designing around variable factors and building interfaces around that way. We got into CSS and HTML syntax and like the basic components of DOM as a whole. We talked about dev tools, and by dev tools, we lightly touched on IDEs and text editors, even though we're not diving deep down in there. But really, it was about Chrome Developer Tool, which is part of Chrome, and also how Safari has those in there, and then so does Firefox. But my recommendation is to use Chrome and or Safari for development. And throughout this today and last time, we were just using Chrome to kind of dive down into the code. And then from there, we talked about inheritance, and especially using Chrome developer tools and how that you could dive down and see where it was coming from, the browser as a whole, how you can override and extend different properties. So today we're going to continue talking about inheritance. We're going to be talking about the cascading effects of CSS as well as specificity for CSS, and we definitely touched and kind of ended on specificity too. We'll also be talking about some of the common CSS selectors and getting into responsive. So we'll talk about the at media and how to make something kind of responsive, which will be a start of positioning, but that's where we're really going to focus on the last day of this course is positioning. Thank you, Brian. And kind of building out something. And then we're going to talk about object-oriented CSS and reuse with CSS as a whole, and then some methodologies attached to it. So the three methodologies that I kind of planned to talk about were BEM, Atomic Design, CSS. So the one that's a little bit maybe not as related to just CSS is Atomic Design, but I still like to talk about it because I think it's a great way to approach your development processes in building out interfaces as a whole. Brian, if I start making like weird motions, that just means there's probably someone downstairs, and if you don't mind letting them in. Is that cool?
Show them where the bathroom is.
Yeah. Yeah. So then just kind of reminding everyone their name. So we can do a quick little introduction. By now, you guys should probably know who I am. If not, maybe you slept through the last class, but you showed up, so that's good. So just going around really quickly, just say your name and like what your profession currently is, and again, trying to create kind of like a community here that hopefully will go on afterwards. So yeah.
What? My name is Richard. I'm art director at Abercrombie.
My name is Julian, and I'm marketing coordinator at software developer in town called AWH.
I'm James. I'm a designer at
I'm Scott Belsky, and I'm actually starting an internship in another week or so for the state in web development, DC, and all kinds of interesting stuff.
Joe, I'm currently working at a little scientific R&D type company, but I'm hoping to get into open.
Katie, I work as a web designer at Justice, which is formerly limited to developers.
Yeah.
Retail. Hi, I'm Bailey. I do product design. I'm Lisa. I was in product management.
Cool. And then my three helpers today, we have Ali, Mr. Vogel, and then a special guest, Jonathan. So Brian's over at Nationwide. You can do your own introduction, I guess.
So I did a lot of print layout, and I'm doing UX and kind of ad hoc marketing everything. I'm working in a smaller division. Imagine a big company has a bunch of little companies in it, which doesn't work out so well. So I do everything from like After Effects, prototyping, animation to UX.
I'm Jonathan. I just started at Cardinal on Monday on the
dev bootcamp graduate, so I, as of like last November, hardly knew what like variables and that type of stuff was, and now I have a position here. So yeah, all this is pretty new to me too. But Kevin asked me to come check it out and give him some input, so here I am.
Yeah, so he's observing today, similar to how we had. I don't remember if I explained, but Baltic was observing because we're trying to also extend this class to educate high school students. So before, like, someone like in their senior year of high school or even maybe earlier on, trying to get them to think about a technology career and do some base training for people in high school ages. And we were talking about the Dev Boot Camp because Jonathan really does know his stuff. It's really amazing how quickly they can get someone up to speed on stuff. So trying to get feedback from him today on how we can improve this same structure for Columbus Web Group. And then Ollie has been the cameraman, but today because we're doing more in the browser and also diving into code, he's not recording it, but he's helping me edit stuff for this. Do you want to do an introduction to yourself?
Excited.
Yeah.
I'm helping with
Yeah, but if you guys need anything, Ryan will show you where the bathroom is. He's really good at that. And I've said it a bunch of times. If you need to take a break, if you have questions, please interrupt me and try to make this more of a conversation so I'm not just standing up here. If you need drinks, you need an impromptu bathroom break, let me know. It's a small group, so we can be flexible. Cool. So any questions from kind of what we covered last week? And again, we're going to be talking about specificity, inheritance, cascading effects. Again, yeah.
You're not going to record this then?
I am actually recording on just my machine. So
Would you say the best way to follow along today is to do it on our own computer, follow what you're doing?
we can definitely do that. And so
Take notes, or?
taking notes would be probably the best for this beginning part. So I'm going to kind of continue walking you through some of the stuff. It's going to be less slides this time. And next week there's going to be a task that you guys are going to be building out and kind of working together as a group to kind of get through it and taking in everything that we've hopefully have learned over the past 2 courses. But if there's time towards the end, I'm hoping that we can actually start doing that today. Unless people want to go down more of that path. So I know different people learn different ways. I'm flexible. All right, cool. So again, kind of starting back with the CSS HTML syntax as a whole. I just want to talk about selectors, generally speaking. So really about keeping them short. So these are a couple little bullet points on selectors as a whole. So how you're applying the styles to your DOM and within that class attribute. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong when your selectors get long. And by long, it's about that specificity. So having dot this, dot that, dot whatever. And the longer the selector is, there's more opportunities for you to mess it up as you're trying to style. So the idea of keeping them really short. So I think not acceptable as well as unacceptable are saying the same thing, but I use not acceptable as someone really good at English because that may be poor English. I look at you. You have like an English accent, so I figure you probably. Yeah. Yeah. So this is what I mean about a long selector as a whole. So it's like this dot child and then some direct descendants and some of those other things. You want to kind of avoid that as a whole. So instead of having this long selector, it should be just like dot something. So trying to narrow it down. So with that, reducing location dependency. So similar to that last example, if you have something like dot sidebar and then promo, styling it again I'm inside a container and then targeting down here when it's supposed to be a reusable component isn't really helpful for your project as a whole. And one of the methodologies that I'm going to touch on later is CSS, and it really drives this all out there. But this is something that you really need to be thinking about as you're writing your CSS as a whole. And the idea is that you can use any piece kind of anywhere you want, not just one specific space. So make it portable, and by this it means remove those type selectors from your actual classes that you have, or selectors that you have. So instead of it calling like a list, like ul dot styled list, you just want to call it dot styled list because it makes it more portable and maybe those styles could be applied somewhere else. So it's just removing the actual elements inside of your selectors and making those be more portable to other pieces. And the more and more you write CSS and work on multiple projects, you can actually take chunks of code that you worked on a previous project and reuse it on another one. I would say a lot of my projects, like maybe 10% of my CSS is from another project that I had, and it's just those base reset layers that every project starts off with. So even that is helpful, but there's some base ones that I also include, like when dealing with like lists and also content zones. And then, of course, decreasing specificity as a whole. And I hopefully don't need to talk about this too much right now because we'll be diving into it. And again, does everyone remember what specificity means? If you don't, raise your hand. All right, so specificity. Where's a...
I think I get like the big idea of it.
Yeah.
It's like when, since I don't code on a daily basis, like trying to like visualize what would be more specific.
Yeah. I'll start off with that when I get into coding, just so I don't have to jump back and forth. But basically it's that idea of kind of diving deep down in there. So that long selector that we saw that we said the unacceptable or not acceptable selector, that is a very high specificity into targeting something. And it's also related to something that Harry Roberts came up with this. He said that there is logic in CSS. So a lot of more back-end developers like to say CSS is kind of logicless. It's just a bunch of properties that you're throwing on selectors. But I think this is a really interesting concept, and it's an interesting way of looking at selectors as a whole. So again, getting back to that, keeping it short, right? But using this same example and thinking about what is the logic behind it. So this article came out this year, actually in April, and it was about logic in CSS, that CSS actually does include logic as a whole, and it's definitely rarely viewed, and that's probably the reason why there's a lot of bad CSS out there, and why you see these maintenance nightmares, and so much of the CSS could be reduced if you're just targeting it the right way and thinking about it in a more of a logical sense. So back to this example here. Looking at this guy right here, the logic to look at the span is broken down into here. So if this is the end of it, so I would have my curly brackets and all the properties. All this is saying is if the subject is span, so this guy right here, the conditions are if it's inside this button, and that button is also an anchor, which is a type selector, but then if it's also in the login box, as well as it's also inside of a sidebar, that's a div. So you kind of read it backwards for the logic, and you say if this, that, and kind of break it down that way. And looking at your selectors that way, and talking it through in the sense of being like, if inside this, if inside that. There's someone downstairs. Sorry. Hello? Hello? Hi. Okay, yeah, Brian Vogel's coming out. All right, cool. Bye. All right, so it's just this idea of if this is my subject and then breaking it down. Does this make sense? Do you guys understand what the idea of like, especially if and the conditionals are in programming? It's just a really smart way to start thinking about your selectors and talking through why you're including a piece. Because if I'm just trying to target span, maybe I don't need this login box and especially this type selector combined with a class. So it can allow you to kind of reduce redundancy inside there and also specificity as a whole. So what we're going to do here, So this is where we kind of left off last time on this code pen. And we were talking about a bunch of different pieces and kind of looking at the inheritance model as a whole. And to get back to your question about specificity, do a new code pen. And I want to do one thing because I had it over there. I want that. Okay, cool. Awesome. Thanks, Brian. All right. So specificity as a whole would be, let's think of a good example. So let's just say we have sidebar, and we are trying to target all the anchors inside of sidebar. So inside my base structure, let's just say I have a main, and then I have the sidebar, which has my navigation inside of it. Oops. Oh, that's pretty awesome. I was not expecting that. Ah. I'm just kind of setting this up really quickly here. I'll just call this content. Turn each one in here. 3 and paragraph. This is like a little base setup for a site. You know, this is going to be the sidebar off to the left. This is going to be the title and a block of content inside there. And we'll kind of use this as an example. So let's throw also an anchor inside here. So this is an anchor tag. It's just a href, and you usually would put the full URL inside there, or the relative URL. And by doing this, it will allow it to be clickable as a whole. It's recommended to also put title tags in there. So if there was something specific, just for accessibility, I'll just put lorem ipsum in there. And what that allows me to do is when I hover over it, you'll see the lorem ipsum kind of show up. So it's kind of like a little helper. So we want to make the sidebar nav be the color red. So we do something like this. Sidebar A, color red. Now those guys become red. Now there's really nothing that wrong about that as a whole, but what this is doing is it doesn't allow me to reuse this anchor somewhere else. Say later on we decide to make this guy also red. Well, then what I can do is I would have to come back and remove this and just say now all anchors are red, right? But then what if down here we wanted to put in a call to action for this page that said something like buying more stuff. But we don't want this guy to be red. We want it to be, you know, the classic green color. I should probably reverse these. Let's make these green. Call to action can be red. So I create a class that's called like red. Now I have to add it to this guy and call him red, or CTA.
You don't have to say dot, because you're saying class equals. You don't have to say a class equals dot CTA.
No, so that's a really good question. So how you declare a class in here is with the period, but when you're applying it to an attribute on the DOM element, you don't need to include that.
Also, I had a question.
Yeah.
Did you create like a direct child? Was it say using the sidebar as a class and just use the greater than sign and then a, and then just be focused on that one?
Yeah, so that's getting really specific, or that's higher specificity as a whole. So I'll show an example of that. Now, if we look at this guy, we have the styles, anchors, and then we have this override. And you remember how we were talking about user agent? That's one that you should be kind of overriding as a whole or extending. But then we're declaring this guy and we're getting this slash through on the anchor tag. So this goes outside of the inheritance, and now I'm overriding it with the color red to get this color. This isn't necessarily bad as a whole, styling on a type selector, and especially anchors, you can do that. So you can consider that like your base theming reset. But as a whole, I should probably be styling these a little bit differently and putting another call to action or some kind of like anchor tag on side here. So what I can do,
What's the difference between how you made that a class?
yeah, and I'll walk through this in a second. So now we have this guy. Now we could share this same color green inside of sidebar. So if I wanted anything that had dot anchor to be green and applying it to my actual body content right here, this anchor being applied here, it gets this color green. I can extend these properties to dot sidebar anchor. So now they all get them.
That's just a way of writing two chunks of CSS at once.
Yeah, so what this is, and I can add it to other properties out there too. I could also say any p tag. So this means that they're all sharing the same property of green. And what that looks like inside the inspect. And to bring up the inspector tool, it's Command-Shift-C, but you can also get it from View Window, Developer, View Source, and Development Tools. So it's just up in Chrome View Developer Tools. But the easiest way to get to it is actually right-click and say Inspect Element. I kind of skipped over that last time. So you can see right here that this is actually rendering out on all three of them, but it's highlighting the p tag. And then this guy actually is going to inherit and use the same color. So you can see that it's inherited from p, but then it's also overriding. But it's okay to override inheritance as well as cascading. But this is still working the way that I want it to be. Now the issue is with this guy, because right now we have sidebar and we have anchor, and that's working real great. But then inside here, let's just say we have a little block copy that says like copyright 2015, and then we also want to put terms and condition. Whoop. So do something like this.
Sorry, what does the font sign do again?
That's kind of like a placeholder for an href as a whole. It's considered an inner anchor link. So I'll show you an example of an inner anchor link. But a lot of times when you're mocking up like an interface, it's better to do that. If I was actually putting a URL, like if I wanted this to go to Google, oops, I put http:// google.com. Let's open this in a new window. So this guy, when I click on him, he'll take me to Google, right? And if you put the hash in there, all it's doing is reloading the page and just adding a hash at the end of it. So that's really the difference. It's just for mocking it up. But inner page anchors work the way, oops. If I had something really far down the page, so just to explain where they really come from. So these are line breaks, and I'm going to put, alright, so we look at this page, and then we have this down there. If I wanted to target this guy when I click to go down to this part of the page, I could make that happen. So it's an inner page anchor. So we have all this, and then we have that guy there, right? To target an inner page anchor, all I need to do is have an ID on something. So I'll put ID and say demo, so that's its name. And now on terms and conditions, if I did And when I click on this, it's going to take me down to there. So that's an inner page anchor. And it also changes the URL to it. So I could actually share whatever my URL is, .com/hash test or demo, whatever it was.
And then you could use that to like take somebody to a different section of your site. Right?
Yeah, yes.
Someone needs to click something.
Yeah, so, but the inner page is just for more like single page applications. Sometimes you can you can use them for targeting. It's also a target pseudo selector in CSS, which looking at the hash tag, you can apply styles to it. It's rarely used. But usually if I'm going to like a different page, it's going to be something like this, /terms and conditions, or whatever the title is. And by doing this, this would populate what my URL is. So if we look at this here, look at the bottom left, it says CodePen/terms and conditions. So that's a relative path to where we are on the page. So there's a difference between relative and also absolute, but it's just the way that you look at URLs. So without that slash there, it's now appending to the very end of my whole URL, as opposed to from that root of it. And that's basically how you just link two pages together. So if I had another page that was maybe an HTML file, I could just call it .html. And depending on where it was from the actual project, this is where I'd be basing it from. All right, so back to here. Now we have everything kind of as green because that's our brand as a whole. But I don't want terms and conditions to be green. So first thing I'm going to do is remove this green, the paragraph tag. We'll go back to black. And I'm going to create a style that's called legal. Whoa. And I don't want that. I need to crack my fingers or something. So I'm going to do 999. So again, I'm adding this class called legal. And this guy's going to become gray. But now we have my anchor inside there that is green, and I want to align with the styling of the colors around it. So I could do something like this. And now they both have it. So that was a lot of work just to make that all the same color as a whole. Well, what we can also then do is get really specific here. So now what this is saying is anything that has the class anchor, so looking at him right here, anchor is green. And then this is something that says anything, if it's an anchor and it's a direct descendant of an list item or an LI element, and if it's inside of sidebar, apply the color green. So then we look at this anchor and we say, okay, this anchor is a direct descendant of the LI and is in sidebar. So I skipped over the UL, but I could get more specific here if I wanted to. I do something like this. So now it's there. And in this case, I could actually do this. This is so high in specificity that almost anything, like nothing would kind of win over this except for an important or an inline style. This is not recommended to do as a whole, but what this is doing is it's targeting that guy. Because let's just say we added a div around this for some reason, because we needed to add two different zones in here and we wanted to space them out. So we're now moving it this way. So now I have two div wrappers around my paragraph as well as that list. Now those guys aren't green anymore. And I have to look at why that happened. I could remove these. Let's just go back here. And now, so I didn't have this in there. This terms and conditions goes back to being green. So then I can make the guess in just saying this. Try to get what I want. And now I can have the styling here. One of the things I like to do is actually this on anchors. Did I spell that right? Inherited. There we go. There we go. So here I have these guys, and they're being, targeted specifically in this case. But again, this doesn't allow me to reuse the style across the site. It does give me the style. I do have anchor. I could reuse it. But again, you should probably be looking at this more from a standpoint of something like this. And you shouldn't be afraid to add classes and multiple classes on a single property. Right. So now looking at these guys, we have the color green. It's overriding the type selector, which is fine in this case because this was a base reset that I set out there. It's not like my anchor was initially another color. It's about kind of targeting a wide range and going down. And then we're overriding the user agent, which again is perfectly fine because that's just inheritance from the actual computed from the browser. So that looks good. We have this guy. Again, there's no conflicts. We don't see the slashes. The slashes are performance issues. We see this anchor inside here. The only thing that's slashed is the user agent as a whole. We see this anchor here, and it's going to be just like the other ones. And now we have this buy more stuff button. Cool so far?
Is it a good practice to use the inherit property?
I'm sorry?
Is it a good practice to use the inherit property?
Yeah, it depends on your whole architecture as a whole. So depending on the project and when I get into it as a whole, inheriting and kind of cascading through from like type selectors, there's a good way and a bad way of doing it. And the next thing I was going to touch on is kind of alignment and doing a reset and what that means, because I keep saying that. And do you guys know what a reset means? Okay.
Resetting the styles back to the browser.
Yeah, so it's stabilizing it. So you're resetting back to the actual and trying to look at how they would look across multiple browsers, but then also doing it for an individual class that you have and trying to make sure that it can be portable to be applied to any type of element as a whole. So overriding inheritance as a whole, it depends about your overall architecture, and depending on how you kind of approach your resets is another piece of it. So it's the overall architecture of it. And by doing targeting type selectors, and type selectors, again, like this anchor is a type selector, it can set a broad across the whole project, and then you can just extend it down, even though you may be overriding. Like one of the major ones is, do you see the spacing here? And we talked about this last time. So H1s through H6, they have this margin before and they have this margin after, which is this 0.67 m. A lot of people hate that, and I'm one of them. So if I wanted to reset that, I could do all my H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, and say margin top is 0, margin bottom is 0. So now that doesn't have that on the top and bottom. Another one that does it is this paragraph tag. We can do that, as well as our UL. So I can reset all those. to kind of have the same foundation. So there's global resets. There's some really nice projects out there, but when you're resetting it, I recommend doing it based off your project. And I would kind of steer away from this, especially if you're coming into a project that isn't new. So if you're starting from the beginning of a project, this is okay to do, but then you also need to be crafting up a solution to add spacing in between. So let me make a note to get back to that. Do this.
So what you're trying to say is when you first start the project, have that, and once you get pretty far into it and you have a specific mock-up, you already have your margins and position set.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can do these resets, but then you need to have a way to overcome and set them into the theming of your site.
So are M's the default for those?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you wouldn't want to go and change those to different.
You can.
Okay.
Spacing and units are one of my favorite things to talk about. And I wrote a library for creating spacing and units for your projects. It's actually written in Sass, which that's one of the things I'm hoping we can slide in, at least a quick little introduction next week or maybe towards the end of today. But basically this is a starter kit for creating unit and spacing for your project. And it's just using this little like Sass map, which is like this. And this looks way more confusing, but I have some like starter kits out there that just copy and paste and you can put it in your project and it generates the styling for you. Yeah, so like right here. These are the units around here. So a lot of those resets, like those hard resets, those margins, top, bottom, I would need something like this to be included or a strategy on how I'm going to be spacing them out. But M's are the default. I go back and forth between M's and pixels. And nowadays browsers have gotten smart enough where you can go back to pixels. And I'm very familiar with working with M's, but a lot of developers and UI people still do pixels. Some people say pixels are expensive for rendering, but not really. I would recommend checking out this project as a whole. It's gone through many iterations, and the current one's like really clean, simple, and allows you to do it. The biggest piece is, so if you look at this, there are some settings inside here. So this is 4 times my default unit. So my unit is defined as a variable right here, but I could increase this, and then it updates it across my whole project. So that goes from 20 as my default to 40, and it takes into account the digital landscape. So once I get smaller, we don't need as much spacing. So I just have an arbitrary breakpoint that I can add inside there and say this is when I want to change from 40 to 20 pixels or from 40 to 10 pixels. So you can target different sizes of the browser with it. And that's why it's one of my favorite topics. All right. So what we're going to do is kind of go from this buy more stuff, and we're going to create classes that are they're going to bring up also like inheritance as a whole and trying to fight against like specificity and creating a class that is extendable and based around object-oriented CSS as a whole. So before diving into that, who is familiar with object-oriented CSS? Who has ever heard the term object-oriented CSS? All right, cool. So it sounds way more complex than what it really is. And it's only been around for a couple years, but there's 2 main pieces of it. And I have little notes on this because I always say it wrong. But the base one is separating the structure from the skin. So you're creating components in your UI zones that don't have styling applied to them, because you're going to handle that in other pieces of classes and selectors. Similar to like how I showed you creating a class for this anchor that is just green, and the same thing for the CTA that's red. You can then apply those to your structures later on. But I wouldn't want to create a structure that has styling attached to it because it reduces the opportunity for me to reuse it. So I want to keep the structure and the skin kind of separated. and really focus on the second piece of it, which is around the content. So not creating selectors that are based around something like this. So remember how we had, let's just say, sidebar P, color blue. I don't really want to be doing that as a whole because this is not very portable and it's not reused. It doesn't allow me to really reuse this because it only exists in the sidebar and if the paragraph's inside there. So again, it's kind of related back to specificity and also inheritance, but you don't want to be doing this. You would just want to create a class similar to how we have legal here. This is also a good review. Do you guys know why this is blue as opposed to gray? Yep. So it's more specific, and specificity, again, it doesn't matter if it's in the beginning of my CSS or at the end, it's still going to win. So as I put it at the top of the CSS and put it at the bottom, it's still going to win no matter what. Even though I've declared legal as my class and it's being applied here, we have more specificity attached to this, and that's why it's winning. And again, we'll continue to talk about that, but that's one of the most important pieces. So object-oriented CSS is just based off those two. It's the structure and the skin and the separation of the containers and the content, and really looking at the use cases of them, using things like helper classes. So as I said, if I keep saying this, the phrase helper class, so if we had sidebar and then maybe a helper class was like style or style 1. So then I could have two different sidebars that have two different styles attached to them. So maybe this was a 3-column setup. So we have a sidebar on the left, we'll have one that happens afterwards on the right. So we have style 1 and style 2. Dot style 1 is going to have a background color of gray, and style 2 is going to have a background color of black with a color of white. So here they're reusing the same structure as a whole, but they're being styled differently. Did I lose anyone on that one?
Isn't this just like isn't that the whole point of separating out HTML and CSS in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people don't understand that as a whole. So I could do something inside here again, just as an example. I'm going to do a reset on this. I'm going to say list style none, just so you can see these two kind of being more aligned. So I have these guys, again, they're doing the exact same thing, but they're just styled differently. All right, so back to this button. I want this to look like a traditional button. So just so I don't have to use hand gestures, we're going to it's going to be like this, and this is going to be red, and it's going to have this buy now. That's going to be white. And this is white. Interesting way of doing this. There we go. There. It won't. The font's going to be a little bit different than that, but it's going to be a red button that looks like that. And what I want to do is I want to make this button be able to be used on an anchor element as well as an input type submit, as well as a button. So there's different types of elements that still act as a call to action. So to do that, let's do this. And they're all going to use the exact same class. So here we have CTA, right? I'm just going to line break them so they'll be stacked up next to each other. And I'll make the 3 different versions of it. So we have button. Buttons don't need the hyperlink side of it. You'd apply them. So buttons are used for submitting forms, and that's primarily it. They're meant for a form, but they don't have links attached to them. So if I hover over it, I can't see the anchor down in the bottom. Same thing here. They're supposed to be more based off of the content that you're actually working with in dynamic states. And then the last really goofy one, and this is the goofiest of all of them, is submit. This one should not really be used, but you'll see this come across on some different projects. Oops. This is an old school way of making the button. So if we look at these guys, and let me space this out just for you to see it. Alright, these 3 guys look completely different out of the box. But I want them all to look like that. So, looking at how to get started, I have an anchor. An anchor is probably the easiest one to style out of all of these. I have this button, and I see what all comes from it. So I see that it has a cursor. That's cool. It has this text align center, which is interesting. It has some additional stuff, and I can look at the computed of it. It has this padding that's attached to it. Not really sure why that's there, but it is. So I want this guy to have 20 pixels on the side and then some additional spacing on the top and bottom. So I can dive inside here, the computed as well as the styles, and see what those are. But as I said, the anchor is the easiest one to get started, and that's what we're going to start with. So we're going to have CTA. And I'm going to change this to background color, red, color white. Cool. So right now, they look nothing like it. Sometimes on projects, I've definitely seen things like this where they're like, no, you're applying the class, and it's on a different element or something like that, and they're like, it looks like it. It doesn't really look like it at all. So what I'm going to do, I can see that there's a border around here. It's a little bit too big. So I'm going to get rid of that. So now they're starting to get closer. This guy has this underline inside of it. So if I want to figure out what that is, again, it's an anchor. So it has text decoration underline. I can get rid of that. That's also a good way, like if you forget what a CSS property is. None. So now they're looking a little bit closer. Weird thing in some of the gotchas on these guys is they have different font sizes. It's because buttons are form elements as well as the input. So they render differently. They have a base font size attached to them, which I don't know why the browser renders it at the small size, because iOS and Android, if you're, and also following accessibility guidelines, you need to have a minimum of a render out of 16 pixels. And if it's smaller than that and you focus on an input field, what happens is the browser zooms in and it kind of has this horrible effect where it breaks everything. And then you unclick it and you're still tucked into this weird zoom effect, and someone has to know to like double tap on like the white space around it to zoom back out. So lesson from that is make all your forms a minimum of 16 pixels. So anyways, we'll do this font size. For sake of today, I'm going to put font size 16. Another thing is, these guys are inheriting a different font than what this guy is. Let's put Arial. So now we're starting to see this a little bit better. But they still don't look the same. Sorry, I put the wrong thing in there. These two are more aligned because they're both form elements as a whole, but the anchor is not. Let's also throw in the mix one other element. Let's make it a span. That was the most ass-backwards way of writing that. Alright, so right now they're all different things. A span is an inline display. These guys are inline block, and this is the anchor is also inline. Now the issue with inline is if I put padding, I'm just going to do a padding left, and I'm going to say 40 pixels. Oh, am I already applying that? Blown away there. Huh. That's my bad. So I want to make this, well, inline as a whole have styling structures, and I thought padding was one of them on there, but I'm wrong on that. I'm going to give it some space on the top as well on the sides. So this is the shorthand of padding. So padding in the long, more express way is padding top, and I would say 10 pixels. Padding right, 20 pixels. Padding bottom, 10 pixels. Padding left, 20 pixels. Right? So that gives me the top, right, bottom. I can also write it as top, right, bottom, left. But because these two, the top and right, are the same as bottom, left, I can do the shorthand, which is this. But if I wanted my bottom to be 30 pixels, I could do that.
So it just goes like clockwise.
Yeah. The one thing about this, the shorthands, I don't like to recommend them unless you really need to use them. So say I just needed it to be padding left on the side, doing something like this. So I'm like, all right, top, right, bottom, left, 20 pixels. But by doing this, I've declared what the top, right, bottom, left, the top, yeah, right, bottom is, and I only need to declare what the left was. So in the case that you don't need to do that, padding left works best. Padding left. CSS is so proper. So we're getting closer here. So they're now all kind of looking the same. Let's add one more thing. There we go. Now they're all the same. Another piece is, if I put a min width on here, let's just say it's 150 pixels. These guys get goofy. That's because they're form elements. If I did this, same thing. Do you guys know the difference between min and just width as a whole?
Is there like a minimal width for breaks or something like that?
So min width, if my width was, min width was 70 pixels, right? Let's make it 50, something really small. These guys are bigger than 50 pixels, right? So it's looking at the inner content inside of it. But if I looked at this guy and changed it to just like a B inside here, it has a minimum width of 50 pixels, right?
No matter what you're putting in that CSS.
Yeah. So it's a minimum. It's never going to be smaller than 50 pixels.
So you can have the CSS one standard throughout the.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you say, and it comes into play, like if I have maybe like a modal, and on the right it says accept, and on the left it has like decline. Even though those are pretty close, it's like I could set like a min width on them so they visually look the same. But if one was a little bit longer, then it would extend out.
No matter what the size of the void is.
Yeah, it's going to be a minimum width. So that's why this guy's 50.
And you can have a
Yep. Yeah. So, but with the content, it's going to overflow out. So you'd have to kind of also tell it not to do that. So let's do a min width of, let's do 150. Okay. What I also want to do is the text align center. So now they're all centered in here. And now we look at these guys. And one of the things you'll also notice is when I hit this, it has this outline on it, and the same thing with this guy, and that's because they're form fields. And I can right click on any of these guys down here and force element into focus state to kind of see why that little blue, what that blue is, and it's right here. It's this outline focus. So I can reset this across my project on focus. And say outline none. Or I could do it on the individual element. So now those guys are cool. Another thing I noticed is I have the pointer cursor. These guys have just the traditional mouse, and then I have the type. I could say cursor, pointer, and now they'll all be the same. Now we look at this guy. These two guys, why are they different than this guy?
Are you saying the difference between the links and then the actual buttons?
Yeah. So actually, this would be kind of a good thing. So if you want to go online, CSG training, Columbus Crew. So that's the password for in here. And I have this guy on my code pen right now. And just so you know, my code pen is if you go to codepen.io/KevinMack18. And it's this first one down here.
So Kevin Mack
18, sorry. Codepen.io, KevinMack18.
And we don't see your face.
That's my face. Yeah. That's a cool project. It's it scales horizontally and vertically, keeps aspect ratios too. And then go to public, and it's the first one right here.
I'm getting the code, but I'm not getting it.
Go back one more. So right, it's in my public right here, and then this guy.
So it's removed, so every change you make, you actually see it.
Yeah,
Oh, that's cool.
CodePen Suite. And then so if you want to take 5 minutes and try to figure out how this guy is different than this guy and this guy. Thanks, Brian.
I'm going out. I can join.
Oh man, come on.
You have one job, Brian Vogel.
The submit button is a form button, so whatever data is in the form, you click on it, it'll transfer to the server side once it has the info. And then the button itself, well, really,
Mhm.
button. It's not anything different. But you can still put a value to it.
Mhm. But why are these guys different?
As in like the
The visual of it, yeah.
But it has to be something on the browser side. The browser.
Mhm.
side.
Hmm. Exactly. And would you make any suggestions to the DOM as a whole?
Is it because the button the flex box? And it's basically it's proportionate to the actual screen size.
No, because they're all being reset to display inline block right now.
Is it the box
Is everyone back? Do you want to take a little break here? Do you guys want to use the restroom? Because I kind of do. All right, so let's add one thing in here. Yeah, that's the answer. So this is one thing, I brought this up last week too. So box sizing is one of the weirdest things when dealing with resets and one of the strangest pieces of units with CSS. So every single project, I include the following. And I'll explain what that means, but I'm going to take a small break. But I actually kind of want to know how you figured that out.
It was the only thing that I saw
Yeah.
on the side.
Here, I'll show you. There's also different ways that you could have come up with a similar solution. So you could have also put like a span inside of it and then put the padding in there and did the reset of 0 inside them, which I'll explain with border boxes once we get back. And that would have the same effect, but it's really just right here. Oops.
Sorry, is that the
Yeah, was it? Where is it? Oh, right there. So border box versus, oh man, first time on a computer over here. Oh, this one just doesn't have it, but this is really the difference right there.
anything that's not code written?
Yeah. So this is interesting too, yeah, like literally every single property is rewritten on here. But when we get back, we're going to talk about border box and then also how we can clean this up and make it be more of a reusable component. Because the two pieces of object-oriented CSS, I kind of like broke the rules by the way of doing this demo. So let's just take a real quick 5-minute break.
I'm gonna have to run out for a second. You could let me back in 5 minutes, or I can just do an hour. Okay, thanks.
Everyone's gone here. Did you get a haircut last night already? I got my haircut last night. Thanks for noticing.
I need to get a haircut.
Yeah, I
All
love.
this crazy stuff happening back here.
I like it. It's cool.
Pseudo mullet.
Yeah. Well, you know the funny thing about like, I always have like, whenever I see like a profile of me, I'm like, I hate the back of my head because I always feel like it's this big like bulky thing. But I think for everyone else, they don't see it. I think it's just like you. It's like you notice something about yourself, and you're like, "Oh man, I really hate this."
We're all kind of the same. Did you? I feel like you just Michael Scotted him when you asked if he got a haircut.
Wait.
Birthday, we called Shane. Okay, isn't it your birthday?
No, I like to notice when people get haircuts. It's like one of those things I do. I don't know. All right, is everyone back here? What a beautiful day. Bless you. And again, I really, truly do thank you guys for coming out and, again, sacrificing another Saturday morning, especially when there's a lot of festivities going on. But it's raining, so it'd probably be fun to be in the rain right now, but hey, we're inside. All right, so we're going to talk about box sizing, bless you, which is another really important aspect, and it's one of those unwritten things about CSS. If your project does not have that hack that I showed, which I'm going to dive into here in a moment, inside your project, it becomes really hard when dealing with spacing and units as a whole. And you have these weird inconsistencies from different elements as a whole. So just going back to where we are, we have now 4 different elements that all look exactly the same, which is pretty awesome. So that means that selector and that class are resetting a lot of things, and it's full of a lot of like really nice goodies to make sure that looks the same no matter where it's being applied. It's incredibly portable from different pieces of the project. So looking at these guys, so they're all 300 pixels, right? So this is 300 pixels, this is 300 pixels, this is 300 pixels. Let's inspect it. 300 pixels. Does anyone disagree that that's not 300 pixels? All right, cool. So what I'm going to do is on demo 1, I'm going to add a padding left of, actually on this guy I'm going to add a padding left of 40 pixels. Demo 1, again, they were all 300 pixels, has now become 340. Why does it become 340?
This is 40 plus 300 something.
Yeah, so how Border Box looks at, and also does the outside. So let's add a margin on all these guys. Let's just say margin bottom so they separate out of 20 pixels. So you have outside your actual container, which is your margin, and then you have your container, and then you have your padding. So padding's inside of your container and margin's on the outside. And when I say units, I'm referring to the actual space or the value of whatever is causing that like gap in between. So when I'm saying units in the case of this, we have a 20 pixel unit spacing, a margin bottom. So there's a margin on the bottom of these guys that are separating them out, and that's how they're spaced out. This guy has a padding left, do this, over here of 40 pixels, and that's why it's being spaced. I didn't say this earlier, but this is how you comment out in CSS. So it's boop, boop, and that's how you do it.
What do you mean by comment?
So this is not being applied to my CSS, but if I remove those, now they're all become centered. I am using Sass, which is a pre-compiled, but I'm writing CSS inside of it. Sass allows me to do this, which is like a quick comment out. And by doing this, it actually doesn't compile out in Sass. So Sass is just, again, a pre-compiler. It helps you create efficiency and also maintainability for a project. It's a pretty complex topic as a whole, but again, if we have some time towards the end after our next one, I would love to talk to you guys about that. And if there's topics that we don't cover in this class, like, again, even after next week, I don't mind being your resource. If you want to meet up for coffee, I'm always down, but preferably we'd be doing it over a glass of bourbon. I'm always down.
So when you've added the padding on the demo one,
Yeah.
the text doesn't align to the center anymore because you've added that.
Well, I also, yeah, right now I just removed the text align. So they're all left aligned right now, but this guy's moved over 40 pixels because I've declared padding left on demo 1 of 40 pixels. Okay. So let's do this on this guy. Whoop. Let's copy this. I probably don't need all these selectors, but so now 1 and 2 have it. What I'm going to do is say box sizing, border box on here. Now what this does is it looks at my container and my defined width of 30 and applies and does not add the additional 40 into the overall box. So again, these guys have the same properties, 1 and 2. Literally the exact same properties. The only difference is 2 has border box attached to it. We look at 1, both padding left. They're both 300 pixels. But this guy's being rendered as 300 pixels, and this guy's being rendered as 340. So what it does is it kind of stabilizes it. Different browsers have different rendering of how they do the box, I guess the box, the border box as a whole. And it also looks at the way, if I add a border on it, a border is another piece, it calculates that too. By putting this in here, it stabilizes it. So it actually gives me my 300. But looking at where I want that padding, to me this is weird that this is 340 even though I've declared it as 300 pixels. It really doesn't make sense. So the recommendation is, and let's do one more. Say we actually wanted them all to really be 340. So let's remove this. Demo 3. Actually, I'll just move this up here. So I want them all to be 340. So I'm going to do 300 on this guy. So he's 340, even though I've declared him as 300. This guy is going to be 340. Cool. And now for this last guy, do one thing between these two. You can see where this gets really confusing immediately. So as I'm doing this, I'm like, wait, where do I want to apply this? There we go. That's 3 different ways to get the exact same output. And I could probably think of a million other ways to still do this. And I could also do a margin left if I wanted to. But they're all 340. That seems like a lot of work just to get one output. And the box sizing allows you to fix that. So this guy, how this is working is there's a wrapper inside here that's being offset. So it's forgetting about padding and it's just offsetting it, so it's looking at inside here. Again, if I made this a padding, bless you, it works the same way. This div is only going to expand to its containers width. So this div is a block element and it expands the full width of its parent, which is declared as 340, but then it has the 40 pixels inside of it. This guy has less code and it is 340 with a padding left, but then it also has the box sizing attached to it. And then this guy is the weirdest of all of them, is 300 pixels, but has a padding of 40, and it's being rendered as 340. So in reality, someone comes along and they say that's horrible, and that doesn't work. Or as the project goes on, someone's like, have you guys heard of box sizing? Let's apply it. Okay, that sounds great. So they add it at the bottom of the style sheet. And they don't tell anyone. They're like, oh, why is this rendering this wrong? I'm going to do this the right way. All right, box sizing, border box. And this is just one of those ones you have to memorize. And I'll explain what these guys mean too. So I fix my guy and I'm on a different page, and then 2 months later you get an email from your client and they're like, why is this guy so small? It doesn't look like the other ones. So now you have to kind of figure it out and dive in here. So when you're making something like dramatic as this, it's something that has to be communicated to your team, and some of the methodologies that we'll be discussing will help you kind of align with that. But I like to start off every project with this. This is just a reset. And I put it as high up in my project as possible so it can scope across everything down and cascade through. So with this, the cleanup on this guy, I'm going to get rid of this. I no longer need it. So if we look at example 2 and kind of go through this in a more proper way, because again, maybe I'm not familiar with this code. I look at demo 2 and I see it as border box here, but then I see that I'm overriding border box. But this is, again, okay because this is inherited down, but I don't need it. So it's an unnecessary declaration of a property, so I can get rid of it. So now 2 is pretty solid. We have the border box, padding left. This guy and this guy, well, we need to make this 340. So they're all 340. Now that's cool. And then demo 3. This is still okay, but I'm declaring this kind of in 2 spots so I could put these all in one. So now they're all 340. And now what I've realized is 1, 2, and 3 pretty much have the same output, but I'm treating 3 a little bit differently. So we could rewrite 3 to align with 1 and 2. And I can get rid of this. Now I'm left with what I refer to as trash collection in my CSS. And now we can go back to how we initially had this, a margin top, 340, and this. I have 3 selectors that are doing the exact same. That's okay, that happens in projects, there's no way around it. Instead of doing something like this, which is, again, it's proper, it's fine, it's just really unnecessary because I have 3 things doing the same. And if you can't go and update the DOM, you could use something called an attribute selector. So what I'm going to be targeting is the class. So class is my attribute. And let me do a really explicit one here and say demo1. I'm going to apply it here. So demo 1 has that. So what this is saying is if you have the class attribute and it's equal to demo 1, apply this. That's equivalent to the .demo 1. But where this is different is if I add a space inside here, it no longer works. Or if I added another selector, it doesn't work. So what I could then say is if anywhere inside there it has demo 1, apply these styles. These are a little bit slower of a selector, but sometimes for maintainability you need to, like, in the case of this you want to update the classes, but if that wasn't the case, you could do something like this. You could also say this and this. So it depends on if it starts with it or ends with it. But I'm going to keep this, and what I can do is remove the 1, and now they all have them applied to it. So I have one selector that's looking at class attribute that can have something before or something after it, and it can be applied to it. Or if I just wanted it to be on the first ones, I could do it that way, which is pretty cool. In the case of this, I wouldn't like that.
You normally save that when you have no access to it.
Yeah, yeah. So I've worked with e-commerce platforms and also like compiled languages where you don't always have direct access to manipulate and style the DOM that you want. So that's when, you know, specificity does, like, there's no way to avoid it. And to write CSS this way, you'll have to do little hacks like this. But this is it's an interesting way to also approach selectors as a whole. So the other thing is I have this before and after, and those are kind of, they're pseudo selectors. So pseudo selectors are anything that have a colon and a breakdown. You can do a search for this. This is one of my favorite references when I'm telling people to learn about CSS. 40 CSS selectors you must memorize. I wish must was in all caps. This is from 2011, but it still holds true today, and it goes through all of them. So this guy is looking at every single element on your page. No matter what it is, it doesn't care. This applies to anything. So when I said box sizing and that, it's applying to anywhere inside there. You can also do it like namespace it that way. And this list also tells you the support for it. This website is fantastic. I'll send you guys a link to it. But I'm using this before and after. If I highlight and again look at inspector, let me give you a demo of demo 2. And I say after. I've added content from my CSS that's being applied to my DOM. And where this is and being rendered is this after. So it's this ghost element that doesn't really exist. It only exists for styling purposes only. So you wouldn't want to use this for content as a whole, but this is how you can create your HTML and avoid adding additional DOM elements that are just for styles only. So every element that you have can have a before and after. So you can't have a before though. Like I wish you could do something like after, but that doesn't exist. But I could have also a .demo 2 before, and it's going to apply the same thing before and after this. Or I could break this out and say before. Say hi example 1, and then put exclamation marks. And then this is where it's actually being rendered. This is also, so this is saying anywhere before and after it's applying. This is literally every single element on your page gets box sizing. Before and after is also, this is gonna come into play as we talk about clearing floats and positioning of CSS. It's a very, very powerful thing. One of my favorite selectors to use, so do you see how I have this margin bottom on all these guys? So that means my very last one has a margin bottom. Let's throw these guys inside of a wrapper. Let's just call it container. And I'm going to make container be a background color of lime green. Pretty solid. Just padding bottom, or let's just do a padding of 20, so units of 20 all around it. So you'll notice that we have this evenly spaced, right? So there's this first guy, 20 pixels, second guy, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, and then we have 40 at the bottom. This makes me cringe a bit. So then someone comes up with the brilliant idea, well, what we'll do is we'll say 20, 20, 0. There we go. Oop, 20. Well, let's not do that. Let's do this instead. The padding, the margin and padding, you need it for a container, so it actually renders in that border box. It's actually stopping that overflow. Let's do margin top. So again, someone says, let's do 0, 20 pixels, 20 pixels. And you're still not getting it right. So let's keep it 20 pixels here. And instead of doing this on this property, let's say any demo, let's change this to demo 1 across the board. So I'm sick of that example. So we are updating our DOM. Cool. So now they're all the same, but they're next to each other, and I want them to be spaced 40 pixels. What I can say is demo 1. Somehow I want it to be spaced when the next one happens to have a margin bottom of 20 pixels. So there's 20 in between them. But again, we have this 40 down here because the last one's still getting that margin applied. So I look at here and I'm like, why is that happening? Oh, there we have the margin bottom. I could do something more idiotic and say demo 2. This is, you'll see this, people do something like this. Demo 2, and they'll say margin bottom 0. I fixed it. But remember, this goes back to the strike throughs, and it's unnecessary. So margin bottom's being crossed out here. It gives me the look and feel. There's a million ways I could approach this. I'm not recommending that. So what I'm going to say is demo-1. Oops, go back here. And I'm going to use one of these selectors that's on that page and say demo-1. Margin bottom. Margin top 20 pixels. So what this little plus sign is saying is, in my DOM, my next element that follows this selector, so this selector, the previous sibling is this selector. So in looking at this, collapsing these guys right here, I have demo 1, the next guy is demo 1, make it margin top 20 pixels. So now I have the spacing. Super awesome, and it allows me to separate some of those pieces out there. Another thing I can also do is this. So this is just saying it doesn't have to be the next direct descendant of it. It's the next one that's possible. So if I put something in here called like demo 2, this guy doesn't get that space, but the following one does. If I put this back to plus, you can see that kind of space that way too. It's a really good way of creating reusable structural components based off that way. Did I lose anyone on that one? Cool. And going back to our buttons. we're going to talk about some other pseudo selectors here. So here we have CTA. Right now when I hover over them, nothing's happening. So I'm going to say CTA hover. And I'm going to change the background color to blue. Now they all have it. The weird one on here is a span. I'm never going to have a span that's clickable and also looks like this. So it's just really there for styles only. So looking back at our CTA guy, I'm going to break out the elements that make sense and the styles that make sense for the properties that exist. So I'm going to say button, anchor, and I'm going to say type is submit. So that's that attribute selector. So any attribute that has the type of submit, I can put that. And I'm going to remove all the ones that are related more to styles. Remove this guy here. Kind of clean this up. And the hover, I only want it on these guys. So let's copy this. And apply that hover to each of these. So this guy remains as its default element. This guy has a hover, this guy has a hover, and this guy has a hover. So what I've done is I've targeted only the type selector and that element that I want to be applying it to. Now what I've also realized is we have two buttons that we want to be using on our page. I want one of them to be red and I want one of them to be green. Okay. So what I'm going to do is get rid of the background color. I'm going to add a class. I'll just call it style one. No, I'm already using this. We're going to be talking about this later, but I'm trying to think of a way of doing this. I'll just call it demo one for right now. Okay. So after these guys, I'm going to say demo one. So this is my helper class for this. I'm going to say red. And demo 2 is going to be green. Oops, I did that backwards. Awesome. Right? What's interesting about this is I want all my hover states also to be blue. And I've just done that because I've applied it to the CTA guy. But if I wanted this guy to be maybe red on the hover state as opposed to green, what I would then have to do is, now instead of these hover states being applied to all these, I would have to apply it to demo 2, hover, blue, this guy's just going to remain green. We want to do this. So now it's red, blue, blue, blue. But now we're back to our span having a hover state. So I showed you that you could use the type selector. Another really great one to use, but it's a little bit slower, is not. So what this is saying is, if a hover on a span, a hover that has a class of demo2 that is not a span. So that would be all of these except for this guy, which is pretty cool.
Why would you say it? Maybe it's obvious, but why would you say it would be slower if these are not selected?
So some of that's a level 3 CSS selector, and the base ones, like everything in here, background color, everything that we've been talking about, the selectors, they're really quick to render in the browser. Some of these have really poor performance. The best example of performance, thank you, Ollie. English is your second language too, and you're better at it than me. Yeah. So an example of poor performance is, there we go, on a mobile site or you're on your device, and you know how it smooths really, like scrolling is really smooth? A poorly performing website is where it kind of like jitters when it's happening, or it kind of gets stuck on something. So there's different properties that have poor performance. And that could be from the selector that you have or the properties that you're using. So it just takes a little bit more rendering, and it's just the difference between it being the different rendering layers for the browser. So yeah, you can target different how it renders in the page and also performance for the browser and the actual device. But this works. So that's a very common one is hover state. Another one is visited. So if I click on a link and then I want it to look something differently. Cool. Now, what I'm going to do here is quickly, and so we're going to talk about my favorite thing in the world is BEM. And I have a full presentation on BEM that's on YouTube where I dive into like a deep dive in it. So I'm just going to give you a really quick introduction on it. And BEM is a methodology for approaching websites in a large scaling fashion. So projects that are either small, you can still use it, but it's really targeted for large scaling projects as a whole. So something that's going to live for a long amount of time. It's going to have multiple developers on it. And it's just a way of approaching your CSS. So it's a naming convention for it. So it was developed by a Russian company called Yandex, which is kind of like the Google in Russia, I'll say. And they developed this because they had so many developers on their team and the traditional issues with CSS and the scaling issues with it. Their website's hilarious because a lot of their definitions are like poorly translated English because it's all Russian, which sounds like a joke in itself, but it's not. It's just hilarious. So highlighting the important pieces of their definition of what BEM is. So it's a methodology, and it divides the interface into logically independent blocks, and it's for you to create kind of your own library that's based around your project. And it's about the context of the content that you have and the reasons why you're creating different components that live on a page. And it allows you to kind of look at your DOM and your CSS separately, but understand how they would be working with each other and making sure that you're not overriding something. So in that example that I was showing, like demo 1, what I wanted to do was use style 1 in that example, but I was using style 1 somewhere else, so I would have been inheriting that. BEM is kind of the solution and answer for it. And as a developer, I remember thinking to myself, like, oh, I'm so much better at writing code now than how I was 6 months ago. And once I started adopting BEM into the way that I was writing CSS, it became like, instead of thinking like I'm so much better now than 6 months ago, it's like, no, I'm reusing my code from 6 months ago and I'm maybe improving it and looking at other aspects of it. So it just allowed me to create a similar way of approaching all my projects as a whole. So it's 3 entities. BEM is an acronym. It stands for Block Element Modifier. And the block is the first aspect of it. So it is, by definition, a building block that holds content. So it's just a selector as a whole. And there's 2 different kinds of them, and we'll talk about both of them. An element lives inside of a block. So it has a specific function, and there's context to it. So it lives for a reason, and you're applying styles for it. So again, this is really meant for just styling as a whole and creating structures that are reusable and making sure that it makes sense of how you're associating associating pieces together. And I'm going through these really quick because I have an example of it at the end of this. And then a modifier is just an alternate version, so it's a modified version of either a block or an element. So it's still using the same properties, but you're kind of extending it or slightly changing it a bit. Going back to that demo 1, 2, 3, if we were looking at that 340 width and the box sizing, instead of calling it like demo 1, I could have called it demo _1 or version A, B, whatever. So those were alternate versions. Simple block, it contains only elements or elements as a whole. Hard part about methodologies and talking about them, you first have to kind of start at a high level, give definitions, and then get into examples and then almost retract back. That's the issue with a lot of methodologies, is you read about them and you're like, oh, duh, that makes sense. But until you actually work in practice and you become really familiar with them, that's when it starts making sense. So these are really quick definitions. So a compound block contains other blocks or elements. So a little bit more sophisticated, more complex as a whole. So here are the three entities and the naming conventions that are associated with them. So a block, you have a dot, which in this case is a class. It doesn't work with IDs, it only works with classes. So I have dot block. That would be my selector name. It could be dot pizza if I wanted to. Actually, let's say dot box would be a better one, because then my element could be dot block, dot box __ pizza. So maybe it's a pizza box. But in this case, it's dot block __ element. So this is where it gets really important to know what's happening here. So this is the naming convention, is you have block, which is its parent, and inside, somewhere inside that container of block, you have block __ element. __ element, in this case, this element has some specific context to that parent and has styling associated with it. Modifiers are distinguished by this double dash, and that's how you give the naming conventions and extending of them. They can also exist in other places of BEM as a whole. So you can have it on the block, you can have it on the element, you can even have double modifiers, but try not to get too crazy with them. So this is the naming convention for BEM as a whole. Looking at a header and getting into one of my favorite things to do. So after, we talked about whiteboarding as a whole, but this kind of gets into dissecting the design. So you're whiteboarding it, and as a team, maybe you've created a concept for your header. As a team, you should be dissecting how it's actually going to be built and the naming conventions for it. So BEM isn't just meant for developers, it's meant for your whole team as a whole. So you would want to, as a team, be like, what do we call this guy? This is kind of a duh one, and header is like a good and bad example of it because it's not really for reuse, and BEM's all about reuse and reducing redundancy in your code. But here we have the header. So everyone agrees on that, and we say, all right, we have a logo in the search form. So as a team, we decide what those things are called. So as we're communicating with each other, we understand it. So our block in the case of this piece is called header. Anyone's mind blown by that name? Inside of here, we have three different elements. So we have the logo, we have our nav, and we have our search form. So these guys belong, and their styling is only applied in the context of a header. So if I had two headers on the page, they may have different content inside of them, but in the case of this, it's a header, and it's really only one use. The styling and positioning, the colors and other pieces are being applied by the __ and it being an association with header. So if I saw this in the CSS, I would know that it belongs in the header. So we have two compound blocks here, and header nav and search form. So a compound block, again, it contains additional elements and additional blocks and or elements inside of it. And by that I mean we look at this guy, header nav. We know inside header nav there's this list inside of it, and it has specific styling outside of like some of our base resets. And this is a very verbose example too. Usually Ben wouldn't go down this deep. Headers are like one of the only times that you really do something like this in navigational elements. So now we have nav list. And then inside nav list, it's an unordered list with an li and an anchor inside of it. So we start diving down deeper inside of it. So we have header nav list item. Looking at these individual items, which would be the li inside of the actual HTML DOM, if I see this in my CSS, I know that item has to be inside of header, which has to have some kind of relationship to list as well as nav. So seeing this separately, without even seeing the HTML and just calling it that, I understand what the structure of the HTML is. They make sense together. Look at that animation. And I don't know why I highlighted that one. Oh, here we go. We have header nav link. So this one's a little bit different, and I like to bring up this example. Is here we've been very explicit that item only exists inside list, which only exists inside nav, which only exists inside header. But then this guy just has header nav link. And the reason why header nav link is in that whole like block setting and isn't header nav list item link, because I could have header nav link exist in another piece of my header. So let's say a secondary sub-navigation was added underneath here, and there was like a little block down that maybe had, I don't know, terms and conditions. I don't know why I keep using that today, but it just says terms and conditions in your header. But I want to have it look like that guy. It's still in the context of header, and it's still using the same styling, but it's not necessarily in the context of it being inside this unordered list, this list item as a whole. So it's just a way for me to associate it in the context of it being the header and applying the same styles and structures to it. But if there was something that was specific to header nav link being inside of item, then I could also have header nav list item link. So one of those anchors inside there could actually have both of them apply to them. Similar to how we were talking about how CSS properties can be shared in helper classes with them. This is a pretty complex topic, so is this making sense? Yeah.
Still a little foggy when it comes to header nav link.
Yeah.
Header nav list item.
Yeah. Yeah, so imagine that this was, again, just being extended and there was another section inside here. So the context of this guy, header nav list, is talking about this block individually here. And as I dive down, I can add additional styles. But there was a secondary one underneath here, but I wanted them all to look like this. I could just apply this class to that block down there.
So would that work with like drop downs? So like if you hovered and
Exactly.
down and all those
Yeah.
at the same time?
Yeah, and why this is really important is once you get into responsive as a whole, there's a lot of context-based styling that needs to happen, and headers are really good examples of that. Because maybe in the mobile view, they have a background color and they look more like buttons, but on the desktop view, they look more like anchors. And applying something like header nav link to those, I can extend those styles to multiple pieces. And then this is just showing an example of a highlight, so the double dash highlight. So all these are using the same styles, but this guy contains both header nav link as well as header nav double dash highlight. And that's how it's this blue color and all uppercase. So that's the modifier. So when looking at an interface or a design, it's really about dissecting it as a whole and coming up with those naming conventions and planning before you code, because that's where a lot of people go wrong, is they just like dive down the code and then they are not thinking about how these pieces can be extended, and then you have to refactor it at the end. So the quote about BEM is, and again, Harry Roberts comes up, it's just to tell other developers more about a piece of market, what it's doing from just its name alone. So understanding what it does and kind of the context of it. So here are some of the benefits. There's way more, but team members can work simultaneously, and having an understanding and a naming convention for your code as a whole definitely improves scalability, less confusion about what things actually look like, and overall it's just a really great way of approaching CSS. I'm going to skip over atomic design right now, and I'm going to talk about it. So it CSS was developed by Harry Roberts. There's 7 base defaults for it, and it stands for the inverted triangle CSS. It's a relatively new architecture for CSS, so it's not really a methodology. It has methods attached to it, but it's an architectural form. It's a way that you would approach a project. And it's about the conception stage of a project for a large-scaling project. So again, it stands for the inverted triangle CSS. It's really, really new. By new, I mean the first time it was ever talked about was end of last year, and Harry Roberts just did his first presentation on it in April of this year. His website for it, and there's not much writing on it because it's still a developing approach in architecture, but he's been testing it out for the past couple of years and has been trying to get community and people's feedback on it. But a lot of the ideas on it, it's nothing that's mind-blowing. It's just a really great way of thinking about architecture for CSS. And it's broken down this way. So again, it's an upside down triangle. And it has these 7 different pieces. So it has settings, tools, generic, elements, objects, components, and trumps. The first 2 are really reserved for pre-compiled languages as a whole. So SAS has what you refer to as variables. So an example of a variable in SAS would be my unit being 20 pixels. So I could declare a variable and use it throughout my whole project. And then it also has what are referred to as mixins and functions, where I can write a SAS block of code to generate additional CSS. So those first 2 are really reserved for that. But here are the default layers, and there can be additional layers inside of them as a whole. So we have settings. Again, I said global variables, but this is more related to the SAS side of it. And then we have tools, which again is more related to the SAS side. So in a CSS project, you would throw those 2 off and start with generic at the first point. So these are your ground 0 styles. These are like your normalize, your resets, your box sizing. And then you have base, which are unclassed CSS. These are your type selectors, like your anchors, your H1s, your H1s through 6s, kind of, again, extending not just a reset, but some base styling. That's if we decide as a theme, maybe all of our anchors are text decoration none, so they don't have an underline. They would live inside your base. And then you have objects as a whole, and this is where you get into object-oriented CSS. The media object is a great example of it. So these are where you're looking at the structure of the site and not really the style of the site, but those reusable components that are going to be able to scale and hold content. And then components. These are specific pieces of your actual design that you've built out. So this would be like your carousel or your promotion zone or maybe your product list, because you only have one product list on your site. It's a specific block of code that has styling attached to it. And then trumps, which are your helpers, your overrides, and some of your styles with it. Another piece and where people question this whole kind of architecture is there isn't a theme, but theme would actually live between the components and the trumps. And the whole idea here is as you start from the top and you go to settings and you go to tools, generic, base, objects, components, you're getting more specific. So the first layers are, as you're writing your CSS, how can I reach across my whole site? So by styling something like the star, or the asterisk, however you want to say it, selector, that is the most far-reaching selector because it touches every single selector. But then if I have something that's very specific, I don't need to have that at the top. I should have it at the end of my style sheet. And the reason why this came up in his development of it was, as projects like start, everyone has really great architecture and it's like everything's organized in a great way, and then phase 2 comes along and then people just add the styling for phase 2 at the end of the style sheet. Well, what happens with that is this cascading effects of CSS and the overrides, it kind of trumps everything by having those at the end. So if I have, again, dot sidebar and anchor early on declared as being red, but then at the bottom of my style sheet I have dot sidebar A is equal to blue, now it's blue everywhere. But maybe I didn't want it everywhere else, I wanted it to be more specific. So it's this idea of you're far-reaching and you're getting more specific, and the specificities also growing up, like getting more specific as you dive down to the end of your style sheet. And the whole idea is you break it into these chunks and sections, so a developer knows exactly where to dive into the code and manage and maintain it. So I'm not adding a box sizing on a selector, because all I need to do is check the generic setting and see if there's already a box sizing attached to it, because that's one of the most far-reaching ones. And I kind of hit on this earlier. It's just the idea of looking at it as a whole and diving down in the way that you organize your code. So I'm going to go over here and just show the graph again. And this is something that you could bring up to your developers. Oh, don't freeze on me. And it's relatively new, and it is just it's a really smart thing to be approaching your CSS and your architecture for it. I don't know why that's not playing. Well, it doesn't want me to show that. Yeah, it's like, I can do a lot of things. I can do animations for you, but I can't do that. There! All right, cool. So this is, again, as you dive down and look at the top of it to the bottom, it's getting more specific and far-reaching on your site, and the higher specificity are happening at the end of your style sheet. So if this was your style sheet, if this was one style sheet as a whole, you want at the top to be the farthest reaching, the least lower specificity, meaning that it's more far-reaching, and as specificity goes up, you want it towards the end of it, and less reaching as a whole. And that's why those components and actual blocks that have specific meaning are at the bottom. And the cool thing about this is, BEM's definitely my recommendation for approaching the naming conventions for CSS. But whether you're using BEM or not BEM, the architecture for CSS still applies. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's simple, and it's kind of, again, like, I don't remember who he left, but he was like, when I was talking about object-oriented CSS, he's like, well, isn't that how CSS is supposed to be? And it's just one of those, like, duh, yeah, but no one else has ever really talked about it in this fashion. So it's a great architecture as a whole. So we're now at 12:15, and again, I don't want to keep people here. I could talk all day about this stuff, and we hit on everything that I really wanted to hit on today, except for atomic design and maybe getting the browser for you guys. But next week we're going to be talking about positioning and doing an actual live demo, so giving you guys something to dive into. So positioning is going to be half of it, and the other half is you guys getting in there and building out. We're going to be building out the media object, the flag object, and then it's actually the test that I like to do for interviews, which is building a simple grid which will be responsive. So cool. Any questions on that?
So we can all get jobs at Kevin.
Yeah. Yeah.